So many people, myself included in some leagues, benched some surprise breakout wide receivers who showed that week one was not a fluke. But how do they stack up against some established week in, week out names that we've trusted for years? Let's find out. We kick things off with Justin Jefferson, someone who has done all that we've expected of him so far. He leads the league in receiving yards by more than 40, even though we're just 2 weeks into the season. He almost had his first touchdown of the season in week 2, but lost control of the ball just before the pylon, leaping towards it. 206 of his 309 yards so far have been through the air, so Kirk Cousins is pushing the ball down the field to him, and Justin Jefferson's 25 targets have him second in the league, just behind someone who isn't too far down this list, so stick around for that. The matchup against this Chargers team is perfect, as they've allowed the most points to wide receivers over the course of the first 2 weeks. The point total line is set around 50 between two of the best passing offenses, yet most vulnerable defenses in the league. Get ready for an exciting game all around, featuring the best receiver in the game. Right behind Jefferson, we have Tyreek Hill against Denver. Hill is the only receiver with 3 touchdowns to his name already. He also leads all wideouts in broken tackles with 4 and red zone targets with 5. Thanks to the usage in and around the end zone, Hill is currently the wide receiver 1 in standard PPR formats. He's on a healthy offense that has put up 60 points over the course of the first 2 weeks, and now there may be even more opportunity for the speedster, considering that Jalen Waddle did just enter the concussion protocol. Denver's secondary got diced up by a Commanders offense that doesn't really jump off the page to a lot of people, so let's see how they handle a receiver who has looked unstoppable so far. CeeDee Lamb jumps up to the 3rd spot with a nice matchup against the Cardinals this week. Don't be fooled by his 11 points per game line. Remember, the Cowboys blew the Giants out of the water in week 1 and essentially took Lamb out of the game plan before he could even get going. Last week, he had a 34% target share and currently holds the 3rd highest amount of yards after catch at 102 in the league. What does that mean? When the ball is in CeeDee Lamb's hands, good things are going to happen. The only legitimate concern I'd have with Lamb in this matchup is that it's yet another opportunity for the Cowboys to put the game out of reach early, considering they are favored by 12 points across all sports books. This means that Lamb will need to get involved early and often to make an impact. Let's go to the 8s here. We kick it off with Stefon Diggs. Stefon Diggs is one of 9 receivers with at least 20 targets through a pair of games so far. The next closest volume threat on the Bills is Gabe Davis, way down at just 11 targets. While Diggs hasn't had too many down the field looks with a yards per catch rate of below 10, he has caught all 17 of the catchable passes thrown in his direction. He and Josh Allen are like a well-oiled machine at this point, and the fact that he's facing a Commanders defense that has allowed the 7th most amount of fantasy points to receivers only helps his case here. Allen has thrown the ball 78 times in 2 games so far. We can feel phenomenal about starting Diggs week in and week out without thinking twice about it. We're putting Davante Adams at number 5, largely due to a 34.7% target share mark that is the 3rd highest rate in the league right now. So far, the Raiders haven't looked the sharpest as a team, but Adams has been the primary target after already getting into the end zone once in 2 games. He's a part of an already banged-up wide receiving core, with Jacoby Myers being out this past week due to a concussion, and Adams himself took a big hit late in the game against the Bills, but looks to be all right. He powered through a tough matchup against Buffalo by putting up greater than 20 fantasy points in week 2, and I expect him to get around the same against the Steelers if Myers is out once again. I'm not going to panic on Ja'Marr Chase just yet, but when you have someone who has failed to score 10 points in an offense that looks pretty poor through 2 weeks, they've got to drop a couple of spots in these rankings, all right? The Bengals did go 0-2 and come out of the gate sluggish last year, so I'd say look for them to shake it off, but now we've got to worry about this whole Joe Burrow calf injury. To be frank, I'd honestly buy Ja'Marr Chase pretty low right now. He's probably at the best discount you'll ever see him at, considering he's been nothing but consistent through his first 2 years in the NFL. And now we've just seen some outlier performances against divisional opponents where teams typically mitigate each other's success just a little bit more. I mean, just look at the pair of Monday night games we had this past week between the Saints and Panthers and Browns and Steelers. To see examples of that, things can get ugly. The Bengals are favored by 2 points, but with the Rams passing offense having some unsung heroes, and with Cincinnati's secondary losing Von Bell and Jesse Bates this year, don't be shocked if this ends up being a high-scoring contest. A.J. Brown is another one I'd buy low on, and maybe even more so than Ja'Marr in some aspects, because at least he's averaging 8 targets per game. With that being said, he still has plenty of volume competition considering this is a run-heavy offense, and Devonta Smith just snapped last week. He draws a matchup against the Bucs this week, and with Carlson Davis showing up as questionable, it's very wise to monitor his status ahead of this game before making any decisions. This game comes with a 46 total points line, the 5th highest of the week. Baker Mayfield has also looked phenomenal with his new weapons in Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. So I'd say the stars are aligning for a possible shootout. Volume is there, the matchup is there. If Brown doesn't have a great game in week 3, I'd begin to grow a bit concerned. Call me crazy for putting someone who is 2 weeks into his NFL career and was not supposed to perform like this at number 8, but I am putting Puka Nacua up high with these established names. Not only did he shatter the record for most receptions in the first 2 games to start a career with 25, and not only does he lead the league with 35 targets right now, but he showed out against arguably the hardest matchup in the league in the 49ers. Full transparency, I benched this guy against the Niners in a couple of my leagues just to watch Matthew Stafford feed him repeatedly and let him go to work against one of the premier secondaries in the league. Now he'll face a Bengals team that personnel-wise is an easier matchup than that of the 49ers. The Rams are 2-point dogs, so they're set for a balanced to throw heavy script in the final minutes. I love Puka here. One of the only common criticisms of Amon-Ra St. Brown's fantasy value was that his ceiling was hindered just a bit by the fact that he doesn't get thrown to down the field a whole lot, as indicated by his 11 yards per reception last year. Well, so far in 2 games in 2023, he's top 10 in the league in air yards and is logging 14.4 yards per reception with this Lions offense. That looks phenomenal. Even with Josh Reynolds' breakout performance last week, St. Brown capitalized with over 100 yards on just 7 targets. He's got a tough matchup against an Atlanta secondary that's allowing just 133 passing yards per game through 2 games. But let's look at their competition. It has been against a pair of first-year starting QBs in Bryce Young and Jordan Love. And Jordan Love was missing Christian Watson. I like the Jalen Waddle play against Denver, even with how dominant Tyreek Hill has been. But we've got to keep an eye on any possibility for a pitch count with him entering concussion protocol following week 2. More often than not, someone entering concussion protocol will actually miss a week. But Waddle has too much value for me not to address his hypothetical ranking, so he's here at 10. There's plenty of love to go around in Miami, as Tua leads all quarterbacks in passing yards with over 700 right now. Waddle brought in 6 targets last game, and now will face that Denver defense that gave up 35 points to the Commanders. I like him here. Fringe top 10. Let's kick off the C tier with DK Metcalf. DK Metcalf has actually taken a slight back seat to Tyler Lockett from a volume perspective so far, as Lockett has 14 targets to Metcalf's 11, but DK is the down-the-field guy. In fact, his 13.6 yards per reception is actually double Tyler Lockett's average in that category. He's sitting at 6.9. Obviously, those numbers will draw closer and closer as the sample size throughout 2023 gets larger. Metcalf has already logged a touchdown on the season, but he does face a Panthers team that's allowing the 3rd lowest amount of fantasy points per game to wide receivers through 2 weeks. Metcalf is currently nursing a rib injury, actually, but reports indicate that outside of some missed time in practice, at least for now, he should be all right. Keep an eye on this, of course. Devonta Smith exploded with a pair of touchdowns and even a 60-yard catch to start off the game against the Vikings in week 2. And he's actually up on A.J. Brown from a volume perspective right now. It's tough to thrive in an offense with 3 potential starting RB talents in DeAndre Swift, Kenneth Gainwell, and, if healthy, Rashad Penny. But a 29% target share is a phenomenal place to start. 8 of Smith's 11 targets have resulted in plays of at least 20 yards. Last year, A.J. Brown was the main guy and demanded more of those 50-50 balls. Jalen Hurts, in all honesty, doesn't look the sharpest at the moment, at least early on in the game against the Vikings until the run game got going. But when he does start throwing the ball deep a little bit more, expect a few more targets to go Brown's way. Regardless, for Smith, this is a 1,000-yard receiver who has looked nothing but reliable so far. Calvin Ridley came down to earth and struggled against a Kansas City secondary that looks as strong as it's been in years. I'm not overly worried because usage-wise, the upside was still there. Ridley brought in just 2 catches but did see 8 targets, while Christian Kirk had way more success. I still look at Calvin Ridley as the primary option on this team, and the league-high 5 red zone targets he's seen so far would support that trend. Houston doesn't allow a ton of fantasy points to wide receivers. It's actually the 6th lowest mark in the league right now. But I would argue it's because they're 0-2 and opposing teams have been more inclined to quite literally run the clock out in the second half. If you bought in and traded for T. Higgins after his 0-point performance, like we said, congratulations. I hope you started him. 8 receptions on 12 targets for 89 yards and a touchdown is a phenomenal bounce back and then some. I already gave the Joe Burrow spiel, so Higgins' value is obviously dependent on that as well. But overall, I like the 6'4" receiver's odds against this secondary. The 4 red zone targets through 2 games, which ties him for 3rd most in the league at the moment, is definitely a promising sign. Keenan Allen draws a beautiful matchup against the Vikings this week. Yes, this is somebody I warned you all to be super cautious on drafting. And yes, he sits at wide receiver 5 at the moment, but my main support for that statement stood on the injury risk and volume competition. Well, let's look at everything right now. He's obviously healthy. Kellen Moore has this team chucking the ball all over the place. Austin Eckler is bruised up, and the Vikings are once again submitting their bid to be the worst defense in the league, as they've allowed 27 points per game so far and have been getting in high-scoring affairs early. Allen is 9th in the league in air yards, despite Mike Williams earning a reputation as the down-the-field target last year, and I like Allen's odds of going off this week thanks to volume and a weak matchup. Chris Olave is 6th in the league in targets with 21 and has put up 7 plays for at least 20 yards. He has so much big play potential. He not only has the luxury of Michael Thomas being back to ensure that not all of the focus is on him, but I call it a luxury for another reason. Derek Carr has relied heavily on receivers relative to other positions so far, as a league high 74.6% of his targets go to wide receivers. I am sure this changes if Alvin Kamara comes back and produces as he used to be one of the premier pass catching backs in the league, but for now, I'll take someone who has managed to have enough volume to hang around at wide receiver 13 in a standard PPR format without even having a touchdown yet. Michael Thomas, the luxury, is going to force Jair Alexander, the primary corner for the Packers, to pick a side if they are playing man-to-man, and if they're not, beautiful. Chris Olave is phenomenal at finding holes in the zone. We're dialing it back a little on Brandon Aiyuk after week 2. I still believe he is the wide receiver 1 in San Fran, but how much can you do when a team is equipped with the best dual threat back in the league in Christian McCaffrey and an all-pro offensive line? You're going to take advantage of it. San Francisco is just one of 7 teams running the ball on more than 50% of plays so far, and CMC is subtly digging into the target share once again. He has 8 targets already through 2 games. Considering that the Giants were letting Joshua Dobbs and what's supposed to be one of the worst offenses in the league in Arizona pour on the points last week, I think there's plenty of opportunity to go around in this matchup. I just worry that with the Niners being 10.5 point favorites, similar to that CeeDee Lamb situation, right, that Aiyuk in the passing game could be phased out by the second half if this game indeed does get out of hand. We talked about Garrett Wilson as one of our 8 buy low candidates rolling into week 3. Be sure to check out that video if you have not already, but I just don't love the matchup for obvious reasons here. The Patriots are allowing just under 200 passing yards per game, and there's the obvious elephant in the room with Zach Wilson being the guy under center until further notice. The fact that already only 8 of Wilson's 13 targets have been distinguished as catchable tells us all we need to know. It's a relatively small sample size, but it shows that Garrett Wilson's upside is being mitigated. He caught 2 of 8 targets against the Cowboys, a tough matchup, logged over 80 yards, but what could have been if Rodgers did not go down. The one thing this situation has been doing for Wilson is that the Jets will be underdogs in more games now. They're 2.5 point underdogs against this Patriots team, so hope for a throw-heavy scheme with some conversions down the stretch, and hopefully some more volume leads to production. Deebo Samuel is here at number 19 because while Aiyuk is averaging more yards per reception and is already beating Samuel in the receiving touchdowns department at 2-0, I mean, Deebo Samuel's still a Swiss Army knife. You can't leave him off this list. If the Niners go run heavy and then some should they blow out the Giants, Samuel is known to get involved in that aspect too. He already has 7 rushes for 46 yards for an impressive 6.6 yards per carry, so he has not missed a step so far, and he's found the end zone on the ground once as well. The Giants allow 4.6 yards per carry so far. That's bottom 10 in the league. So keep an eye if the Niners end up dialing it back on McCaffrey's usage in a game that could very well get ugly. Mike Evans did whatever he wanted with the Bears secondary last week, going for 171 yards and a touchdown. Despite tying Chris Godwin in targets, their fantasy performances were night and day. Baker Mayfield is throwing the ball 34 times per game, and at least early on, it looks like Evans is the favorite target. He's also 5th in the league in yards after contact so far. So again, great things are happening when the ball is in the hands of Mike Evans. The Eagles did allow the Vikings to stay in the game thanks to great performances from Justin Jefferson and Jordan Addison last week. So the amount of fantasy points given up to wide receivers will be inflated for a bit, but when healthy, this secondary is one of the tougher matchups in the league. I like the Bucs to go even more throw heavy than they have, considering they're 5.5 point underdogs this week. We just mentioned Jordan Addison, and the USC product is surely living up to the hype with a pair of touchdowns in as many games. The focus is not and never will be on him from a defensive standpoint, since he wears the same jersey as the best receiver in the game, which is pretty great. And oh yeah, we mentioned this with Justin Jefferson, but the Vikings are facing a Chargers team that has been giving up fantasy points to receivers like no tomorrow. The margin will run thin at times, considering that TJ Hawkinson also does demand a decent amount of volume. But if you pull Addison's 2 touchdowns out, he's still averaging just over 10 points per game in standard PPR. Despite having below a 13% target share, he is capitalizing on every single opportunity, something we love to see early on. We kick off the F tier with still some really solid options. They just don't have the best situations they're residing in right now. We'll start with Amari Cooper. He's now in an offense that will likely be relying a little less on the run after Nick Chubb's gruesome and almost certainly season-ending injury. Now, each injury should be addressed and researched in his own right, but we saw some toughness from Cooper this week. The man was listed as questionable all the way up until just a few hours before game time, and he ended up with 7 catches for 90 yards against a Steelers defense that looked dominant at times and had 2 touchdowns. They are not scrubs by any means. Deshaun Watson also just hasn't looked great yet. I know it's early, but throwing for less than 200 yards per game so far with a completion percentage in the mid-50s is anything but promising. Not far behind his teammate in Mike Evans, it's Chris Godwin. Godwin has quietly registered a pair of double-digit fantasy performances without finding the end zone. The Eagles are hoping to get James Bradberry and Reed Blankenship back for this week, but as of right now, those two key members of Philadelphia's secondary are questionable. If this team is shorthanded on the back end again, expect the Buccaneers to attack. Godwin has racked in all 10 catchable targets so far, but only has taken one for more than 10 yards. That's not a bad thing necessarily. It means he's getting high percentage passes thrown his way. It just limits the upside and makes him a little more touchdown reliant, but the opportunity is definitely there. DJ Moore is at number 24. Hey, that rhymed. But this is a horrible spot to be in for him, at least from what the Bears have shown so far this year. He broke the 100-yard mark against the Bucs last week, but again, Justin Fields is throwing the ball past 10 yards down the field just a handful of times each game. That leaves all of the work up to Moore, which shows in his stat line, considering that 55 of his 129 receiving yards have been after the catch. Moore is a talented enough receiver to break free here and there. We saw it against Tampa a couple times. It just limits the opportunity for big plays when Fields isn't airing it out to him. Lastly, we have Christian Kirk. Trevor Lawrence got the memo that he was not going to be able to get the ball to Calvin Ridley against the Chiefs, and he threw the ball to Kirk 14 times. If Puka Nacua wasn't putting up insane numbers, I honestly feel like this would have been more of a headline. Now with that, Kirk had 11 catches for 110 yards, right at 10 yards per reception. We're starting to see a dynamic set between the wide receiver duo where Trevor Lawrence is going to take a few more chances down the field with someone like Ridley, who is 3 inches taller than Kirk. Kirk will need involvement early to be a fantasy contributor because we've got another large spread, folks. The Jags are sitting at minus 9.5 against the rebuilding Texans, meaning it could be a Travis Etienne day in the closing minutes. Fringe players who are just outside of the top 25 for me are Nico Collins, Tutu Atwell, Zay Flowers, DeAndre Hopkins, Tyler Lockett, and Christian Watson this week. Thank you so much for watching. As always, pop any questions you have in the comment section below. Be sure to like and subscribe if I helped you with your fantasy situation heading into week 3, and we will see you in the next video.